The roar hit first, a guttural concussive blast that seemed to shake the very foundations of St. Michael's General Hospital. Orange light, hellish and hungry, flashed with impossible speed down the corridor, devouring everything in its path. For Nurse Sarah Miller, one moment she was calm, focused on evacuation. The next, a jarring, brutal force slammed into her side. Air exploded from her lungs. The world tilted, became a confusing maelstrom of linoleum rushing up to meet her, the scent of acrid smoke, and something else, something impossibly hot. And above the bedlam, a raw, desperate cry, not of malice, but pure, agonizing effort. She was falling, tackled by a ghost in a hospital gown, a man who, just minutes before, had barely possessed the strength to lift a glass of water. Why? What terror had transformed the sick man, Arthur Jenkins, into this sudden, unyielding force of nature? What inferno had he seen that she had not? Arthur Jenkins had once been a titan in his own world, a man whose kingdom was built of sweat, steel, and the unshakable certainty of a well-laid plan. For over 40 years he'd been a construction foreman, a respected leader of men who wrestled skyscrapers from blueprints and tamed wild rivers with spans of concrete and iron. His hands, now frail and papery, had once been callous and strong, capable of shaping the stubborn earth and bending metal to his will. He remembered the satisfying heft of a sledgehammer, the precise language of surveyor's transit, the roar of heavy machinery that was music to his ears. He'd stood on girders hundreds of feet in the air, the wind whipping around him, feeling not fear, but profound sense of accomplishment, a connection to the raw, fundamental act of building something lasting, something American. His voice, now off in a thready whisper, had once boomed across noisy sites, commanding respect, ensuring safety, solving problems with a calm, decisive authority. He'd buried his beloved wife, Martha, 10 years prior, her unwavering belief in him a silent anchor he still clung to. "You're stronger than you think, Artie," she'd always say, her eyes crinkling at the corners. He missed her quiet strength, her ability to see the core of him even when he was lost in the demands of his work. Now, at 62, his world had shrunk to the confines of room 312 at St. Michael's. A brutal, relentless pneumonia had ravaged his lungs, leaving him tethered to an oxygen tank, a prisoner of his own failing body. The robust physique that had once effortlessly shouldered immense responsibilities was now gaunt beneath the humiliating thinness of a standard-issue hospital gown. His days were a monotonous blur of beeping monitors, hushed voices, and a pervasive scent of antiseptic. He hated the indignity of it, the dependence on others for even the simplest tasks. He, Art Jenkins, who had overseen crews of 50, who had faced down deadlines and defied engineering challenges, was now defeated by his own breath. The frustration was a constant, bitter companion, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. He'd stare out the window at the sliver of city skyline, a distant monument to the kind of vitality he once possessed, and a deep, aching loneliness would settle over him. Nurse Sarah Miller was the antithesis of his current state, young, energetic, probably no older than 28. She moved to the ward with quiet competence and an aura of gentle efficiency. She possessed a genuine kindness that even Art's gruff, often curt demeanor couldn't entirely deflect. He'd watch her, a silent observer, as she attended to her duties, her brow furrowed in concentration as she checked charts, her smile quick and reassuring to a frightened patient, her touch surprisingly firm yet gentle when adjusting his fore or the nasal cannula that was his constant, irritating companion. He knew she worked long hours. He'd seen the weariness in her eyes at the end of a 12-hour shift, yet she rarely let it show. She was a professional, dedicated to her calling. He sometimes wondered about her life outside these sterile walls. Did she have a family, dreams, worries? She was a reminder of the vibrant world he felt increasingly alienated from. He respected her dedication, that quiet American work ethic he understood so well. "Lungs are sounding a bit clearer today, Mr. Jenkins," she'd said that very afternoon, her voice a small note of optimism in the quiet room after listening to his chest. Keep up with those deep breathing exercises. We'll have you out of here yet. Art had merely grunted. A non-committal sound that masked the flicker of hope her words had ignited. Maybe this time, the antibiotics were truly working. Maybe the crushing weight on his chest would finally lift. He'd even managed to sit in the uncomfortable armchair by the window for a full hour, a small victory. He'd been thinking of Martha, imagining her relief, her gentle teasing. The first hint of trouble was insidious, almost subliminal. A faint, unfamiliar scent, sharp and acrid, snaking its way through the usual hospital smells of floor polish and rubbing alcohol. Art, his senses perhaps heightened by confinement and the clean, filtered air he was forced to breathe, caught it first. It was a smell he knew from decades past. The smell of something burning that shouldn't be, the kind of smell that preceded trouble on a job site. He shifted in his chair, a prickle of unease running down his spine. He dismissed it, an overactive imagination, perhaps a trick of memory. Then came a distant thud, muffled and indistinct, like a heavy door slamming somewhere deep within the hospital's labyrinthine corridors. It was followed by another, slightly louder. Sarah, who had been making notes on his chart near the door, paused, her pen hovering. "Did you hear something, Mr. Jenkins?" she asked, her head tilted, a slight frown creasing her forehead. Before Art could formulate a reply, a new sound pierced the relative quiet of the afternoon. It began as a faint, high-pitched whine, almost lost in the hum of the building's ventilation, then rapidly escalated into an undeniable, ear-splitting shriek. The fire alarm. Its strident, relentless cry was a violent intrusion, shattering the mundane rhythm of the ward. For a frozen second, everything seemed to stop. The distant clatter of a food cart, the soft murmur of a television in a nearby room, the rhythmic beep of a cardiac monitor. All were momentarily silenced, or perhaps just overwhelmed by the sheer urgency of that electronic scream. Then, as if a spell had been broken, the ward erupted into a flurry of anxious movement and rising voices. Code red. Code red. Fire confirmed. West Wing, second floor. All staff initiate evacuation protocols immediately. Code red. The voice over the PA system was strained, fighting to remain calm, but the underlying tremor of fear was unmistakable. West Wing, second floor. Art's mind, slow and foggy from his illness, struggled to orient itself. That was the floor below and one wing over. Close. Too close. He could hear doors opening in the hallway, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes moving much faster than usual, hushed, urgent conversations laced with growing trepidation. The acrid smell of smoke was stronger now, no longer deniable, tinged with the sharp odor of burning plastic. Sarah whirled around, her professional training kicking in instantly. The initial surprise in her eyes was quickly replaced by a focused determination, though Art could still detect a faint, rapidly suppressed tremor in her hands. "Mr. Jenkins, we need to get you ready to move. The elevators will be shut down, so we'll use the stairs. Don't you worry about a thing. We practice these drills all the time." Her voice was a little too loud, a little too bright, betraying the tension coiling beneath her calm facade. She moved with swift efficiency, checking his foredrip, ensuring his small, portable oxygen tank was full and functioning. Art watched her, a familiar wave of frustration washing over him. He was cargo, a burden, another problem for her to solve in a crisis. The old foreman in him, the man used to taking charge, chafed at the indignity of his helplessness. But as the sound of escalating chaos filtered in from the hallway, a distant shout that sounded suspiciously like a scream, the hurried, panicked footsteps, the increasingly thick smell of smoke, something else began to stir within him. A deeply buried instinct, a primal alertness honed over decades of navigating hazardous environments, began to surface through the fog of his illness. It was a feeling you get just before a crane operator made a risky lift, or when the ground fell unstable beneath a new excavation. Danger. Sarah was now at the door, peering out, then speaking rapidly to another nurse who rushed past. Her attention was fragmented, pulled in multiple directions. He saw her glance towards Mrs. Henderson's room across the hall. The elderly woman was frail, often confused and terrified of being moved. Sarah would undoubtedly go to her first. Art pushed himself laboriously up from the armchair, his joints creaking, his muscles protesting with sharp, stabbing pains. Each breath was a conscious effort, the smoke-tinged air already irritating his sensitive lungs. He gripped the windowsill for support, his knuckles white. From his vantage point, he could see a section of the main corridor beyond his doorway. It wasn't just hazy anymore. A sinister, gray-brown plume was actively billowing from the direction of the West Wing junction, roiling like a malevolent entity. And through it, a terrifying, flickering orange glow, reflecting off the normally gleaming linoleum, painting it with the colors of an inferno. The fire wasn't just in the West Wing. It was spreading and fast. It was already lapping at the edges of their own section. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the backdrop of the shrieking alarm. A surge of adrenaline, sharp and potent, cut through the lethargy that had clung to him for weeks. It was a feeling both terrifying and strangely invigorating, a jolt of life into a system that had felt like it was slowly shutting down. He saw Sarah step out into the corridor, turning towards Mrs. Henderson's room, her back to the rapidly advancing threat. She was focused on helping the most vulnerable, a testament to her courage and dedication, but utterly oblivious to the specific, immediate peril that was building with terrifying speed. The smoke in the main corridor wasn't just drifting. It was churning, darkening, swirling with an ominous, oily blackness near the ceiling. Art had seen that phenomenon before on a construction site 5 years ago. A small electrical fire in a poorly ventilated utility tunnel had smoldered for an hour, filling the space with superheated, unburnt gases. When a rescue crew had finally breached the door, introducing a rush of fresh oxygen, the entire tunnel had erupted in a devastating flashover, a wave of flame that had critically injured 2 good men. His blood ran cold. The conditions in that hospital corridor were starting to look terrifyingly similar. "Sarah," he yelled, or rather, tried to yell. His voice emerged as a pathetic, rasping croak, instantly swallowed by the cacophony of the alarms, the distant rumble that sounded like something collapsing, and the rising crescendo of panicked shouts. She didn't hear him. She couldn't hear him. He had to reach her. He had to warn her. There was no time to find another nurse, no time to explain the complex physics of fire behavior that his experienced eyes recognized. He knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty that bypassed rational thought, that the section of ceiling above where Sarah was about to step was a prime bomb of superheated gas, ready to ignite. He lurched away from a window, abandoning his grip on the sill. His legs, weak and unreliable, trembled violently. Each step was an agonizing effort, sending jolts of pain through his hips and knees. His head swam, black spots dancing in his vision. The hospital gown, thin and useless, clung to his sweaty skin. He felt utterly exposed, a fragile vessel against a monstrous force. But the foreman was back, the man who knew how structures failed, how danger escalated, how quickly a situation could turn fatal. That part of him was now in command. He stumbled into his own doorway, gripping the frame for a desperate moment of support. The corridor outside was a vision of impending doom. The smoke was thicker now, a choking, acrid blanket that stung his eyes and burned his throat. He could hear the distinct, hungry crackle of flames, much closer than before. Distant screams echoed, punctuated by the crash of breaking glass. "Sarah!" he gasped again, louder this time, his voice raw with a desperation that surprised even himself. She was just a few yards away, her hand outstretched towards Mrs. Henderson's door handle, her attention completely absorbed by the task of getting the terrified older woman out. She half turned at the sound of his ragged cry, her expression a fleeting mixture of surprise and concern. Why was Mr. Jenkins, the patient who could barely walk the bathroom unaided, standing there, swaying, his face a mask of smoke-smudged terror? He didn't have the breath or the time for explanations. He could see the ceiling panels directly above her begin to sag and discolor at an alarming rate. A low, ominous groan, like the sound of a great beast stirring, vibrated to the floorboards beneath his bare feet. It was a final, terrible prelude. In that instant, Arthur Jenkins ceased to be the sick man. He ceased to be the patient. Some primal instinct, some long-dormant reserve of strength fueled by pure, unadulterated terror, not for himself, but for the young woman in the path of imminent destruction, erupted within him. Martha's voice echoed in his mind, clear as a bell. "You can do this, Artie. You always could." He pushed off from the doorframe, his atrophied leg muscles screaming in protest, his lungs burning as if filled with fire themselves. The world seemed to slow down, the scene etching itself into his memory with hyper-real clarity. Sarah, frozen for a microsecond, her eyes widening as she saw not just a sick patient, but a man possessed by a terrifying urgency. The churning black smoke behind her, thicker, angrier, the ominous glow intensifying. He covered the distance in 3 lurching, agonizing strides. Each step felt like wading through molasses, his body a leaden weight. He could feel the heat radiating from the end of the corridor, a palpable wave. He was there, with a guttural roar that ripped from the depths of his soul, a sound that was part warning, part defiance, part the last desperate effort of a dying engine pushed beyond its limits. Arthur Jenkins launched his frail body forward. It was clumsy, uncoordinated, a movement born of sheer will rather than practiced athleticism. His bony shoulder connected with Sarah's side with surprising force. "No!" He thought he screamed, or maybe it was just a grunt of exertion. Sarah cried out, a sharp, startled sound of pain and utter bewilderment as she was violently knocked from her feet. She had no time to comprehend, no time to react. One moment she was reaching for a doorknob. The next she was airborne, the world spinning, the hard, unyielding floor rushing up to meet her. She must have thought he'd gone insane, this gaunt, wild-eyed patient attacking her in the midst of a fire. They crashed to the linoleum in a tangled heap of limbs and thin hospital cotton. Art landed heavily, the impact driving the last vestiges of air from his tortured lungs. A searing pain shot through his ribs, and for a moment the world went gray. He instinctively tried to twist, to absorb more of the impact, to shield her even as they fell. And then, in the split second that their bodies hit the floor, the universe behind them exploded. A monstrous, deafening WHOMPH, a sound that was felt as much as heard, erupted from the corridor ceiling where Sarah had been standing mere heartbeats before. A colossal fireball, a ravenous demon of incandescent orange and yellow, blasted outwards and downwards, consuming the oxygen, vaporizing everything in its immediate path. The heat wave was instantaneous and brutal, washing over him even on the floor, searing Art's exposed neck and arms. Shattered glass from a nearby observation window, fragments of burning ceiling tiles, and twisted pieces of metal rained down like deadly shrapnel, precisely onto the spot where Sarah had been. The wheelchair Mrs. Henderson had presumably been about to use, left momentarily unattended by the doorway, was instantly engulfed, its metal frame glowing cherry red, its plastic components melting and bursting into acrid black flames. Sarah, pinned beneath Art, felt the incredible, scorching heat on her back, heard the terrifying, elemental roar of the flashover. She managed to twist her head, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief, taking in the apocalyptic scene. The entire section of hallway where she'd stood was now a raging, impassable inferno. If she hadn't been tackled, if Art hadn't, the horrifying, dawning realization struck her with the force of a physical blow, more impactful than the fall itself. He hadn't attacked her. He had saved her. This incredibly ill, frail man had somehow foreseen the cataclysm and, with an impossible, sacrificial burst of strength, had thrown them both out of its deadly embrace. Art gasped, fighting for every precious molecule of oxygen in the thick, choking smoke that now blanketed the floor. His body screamed in protest, but his mind was strangely clear. He tried to curl himself more protectively over Sarah, a meager shield against the falling embers and the intense radiant heat. Debris, hot and sharp, clattered around them. The noise was an overwhelming assault. The continuous, deafening roar of the fire, the incessant shriek of the alarms, the sickening groans and crashes of the building itself beginning to succumb, and the terrified, muffled screams of others still trapped somewhere in the smoke-filled labyrinth. "Crawl!" he rasped, his voice a shredded whisper, barely audible above the pandemonium. "Away from it, towards the main stairs. Go!" He was racked by a series of deep, body-shaking coughs, each one feeling like sandpaper on his raw lungs. But when Sarah's terrified eyes met his, they were filled with an unwavering, almost fierce focus. The foreman was still on duty. Sarah, dazed, her ears ringing, her body bruised, but miraculously alive, nodded dumbly. The primal instinct for survival, momentarily stunned, now surged through her. Together, coughing violently, their eyes streaming from the acrid smoke, they began to army crawl, belly down, away from the raging heart of the fire, away from the unbearable heat. Art moved with excruciating slowness, every inch a monumental effort, his limbs leaden, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. But he kept moving, pushing himself, urging Sarah onward with gestures and hoarse whispers. He was running on something beyond physical reserves now. Sheer, unadulterated willpower, the kind of stubborn grit forged in a lifetime of refusing to quit. The air was a toxic, unbreathable soup of smoke, soot, and chemical fumes. The emergency lights in this section had failed, plunging them into a terrifying, flickering gloom, lit only by the demonic, dancing orange glow of the relentless fire. They could hear frantic shouts, closer now, and then, like avenging angels emerging from the swirling, choking darkness, two bulky figures materialized. Firefighters, their faces obscured by masks and helmets, their heavy turnout gear making them seem like beings from another world, axes held ready. "Over here! We've got 2 survivors down," one of them yelled, his voice electronically amplified, cutting through the roar. "Looks like one of them's a patient." Strong, gloved hands gripped Art, then Sarah, with reassuring firmness, hauling them backwards, dragging them further from the immediate inferno, towards a stairwell door that was miraculously still accessible, though smoke was already seeping around its edges. Art felt himself being lifted, his protesting body screaming at the rough handling, but an immense, bone-deep weariness, coupled with a profound sense of relief, washed over him. He'd done it. He'd gotten her clear. He risked a fleeting, painful glance over his shoulder. The section of corridor they had just escaped was a roaring tunnel of flame, the fire licking greedily at the ceiling, black smoke pouring out like the breath of a dragon. They were half carried, half dragged down the concrete emergency stairs, the enclosed space echoing with the heavy thud of firefighter boots, the crackle of radios, and the urgent, shouted commands. Each flight down brought them to marginally clearer air, though the acrid stench of smoke was pervasive, clinging to their clothes, their hair, their lungs. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they burst through a heavy fire door and into the chaotic, yet blessedly open air outside. The hospital grounds were a scene of controlled bedlam. A sea of flashing red and blue lights from fire trucks, ambulances, and police cruisers strobed across the evening sky. Evacuated patients, many pale and shocked, some wrapped in blankets, others still attached to 4 drips, were clustered in designated triage areas on the lawns. Hospital staff, their faces smudged with soot, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion and grim determination, moved among them, offering comfort, assessing injuries, coordinating with emergency crews. Art was gently, carefully lowered onto a waiting gurney. He was coughing uncontrollably now, a harsh, hacking sound that tore at his chest. His face was deathly pale beneath the grime, slick with sweat. A paramedic was instantly at his side, fitting an oxygen mask over his face, his voice calm and reassuring as he checked Art's vitals. "Easy now, sir. Just breathe slowly. We've got you." Sarah, relatively unscathed physically but emotionally shattered and profoundly shaken, knelt beside Art's gurney. Her neat nurse's uniform was torn and dirty, her face streaked with soot and the tracks of tears. Her composure, her professional shield, had finally dissolved, revealing the raw, overwhelming flood of emotion beneath. "Mr. Jenkins, Art," she began, her voice trembling uncontrollably. She reached for his hand, her fingers cold and shaking, and clasped it tightly. You saved my life. That fireball, I was right there. I would have..." She couldn't finish the sentence. Her gaze fixed on a frail, exhausted man lying before her, a man who looked as if a strong breeze could blow him away, yet who had just displayed a courage and strength that defied all logic. Art managed a weak, tired smile, a faint flicker in his smoke-reddened eyes. He drew a shaky breath from the oxygen mask. "Figured you still had patients to look after," he rasped, a ghost of his old, dry humor surfacing even in this dire moment. Fresh tears welled in Sarah's eyes and streamed down her sooty cheeks. She squeezed his hand tighter. "But how? How did you even know it was going to happen? And how did you find the strength to move like that? Mr. Jenkins, you could barely walk this morning." He coughed again, a deep, painful spasm that shook his entire frame. He took another shallow breath of the precious oxygen. Old habit from construction, he managed, his voice weak but clear. "Always watch what's above you and what's building up pressure." Looked like a classic backdraft waiting for a trigger. He paused, his gaze becoming distant for a moment, as if replaying the terrifying scene in his mind's eye, seeing not just flames, but the invisible physics of fire about to explode. "Had to get you clear." A soot-blackened firefighter, his helmet now tucked under his arm, his face etched with exhaustion and the grimness of what he just witnessed inside, approached them. He was the captain of the first engine company to reach that floor. He looked from Sarah to Art, his expression one of profound respect. "Ma'am, are you the nurse this gentleman pushed out of the way just before that section flashed over?" he asked, his voice rough. Sarah, still clutching Art's hand as if it were a lifeline, nodded mutely, unable to speak past a lump in her throat. The firefighter looked down at Art, shaking his head slowly in disbelief and admiration. "Sir," he said, his voice filled with a rare awe, "I've been fighting fires for 25 years. I've seen a lot of brave things. But what you did in there, recognizing that flashover condition and getting her out of the kill zone with seconds to spare, that was one of the most incredible acts of courage and quick thinking I've ever witnessed. You were right. It was a backdraft. That whole end of the corridor went up like a bomb. You saved her life, sir. No doubt about it. Most civilians freeze or run blindly. You ran toward the danger to get her out. And from what I'm hearing from your nurses, you, sir, are a patient who by all rights shouldn't have even been able to get out of bed, let alone do that." Art just gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, his eyes closing briefly. He was too exhausted, too overwhelmed to respond further, but within the frail shell of his body, a profound sense of peace, of purpose fulfilled, began to settle. The foreman had done his job. He had protected his charge. The news of Arthur Jenkins' incredible heroism spread like wildfire itself through the stunned crowd of evacuees, hospital staff, and emergency responders. The story was almost unbelievable. The frail, seriously ill patient in the flimsy gown who had somehow summoned superhuman strength and foresight to tackle his nurse, saving her from certain death in a massive fireball. It sounded like a script from a Hollywood movie, but the charred, still smoldering evidence of the hospital wing, the intensity of the blaze that had been narrowly averted for Sarah, and her own tearful, heartfelt testimony were undeniable, vivid proof. Other nurses and orderlies who had cared for Art, who had seen him at his weakest and most vulnerable, looked at him now with a mixture of astonishment and profound admiration. Patients who had perhaps only offered him a cursory nod in the hallways now saw him as a figure of legendary courage. The label of sick Mr. Jenkins was being rapidly, irrevocably replaced by Art Jenkins the hero. As the paramedics carefully prepared to transport Art to a neighboring hospital for urgent assessment and continued care, his heroic, Desperate exertion had undoubtedly placed an enormous strain on his already compromised lungs and heart. Sarah leaned in close, her face still wet with tears, but her eyes shining with an incandescent gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion that transcended mere words. "Thank you for my life. Art, I will never, ever forget what you did for me." She squeezed his hand one last time, her gaze conveying a depth of thankfulness and awe that he felt to his very core. He met her gaze, and for a long moment, the years of gruffness, the bitterness of his illness, the pain and frustration, all seemed to melt away. In her eyes, he saw not just a grateful nurse, but a fellow human being he had been privileged to protect. A small, almost serene smile touched his smoke-stained lips. "Just doing what needed to be done, lass," he managed, his voice barely a breath. "Take care of yourself." The fire at St. Michael's General Hospital raged for many more hours, a fierce and stubborn beast that tested the limits of the city's firefighting crews. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky with hues of gray and orange, the full extent of the devastation in the west wing and parts of the third floor was revealed, a stark, blackened skeleton, a grim monument to the destructive fury they had battled. But miraculously, thanks to the swift and disciplined evacuation protocols of the hospital staff, the unwavering bravery of the firefighters, and the singular, astonishing courage of individuals like Arthur Jenkins, there were no fatalities directly attributable to the fire in that ravaged section. There were numerous injuries, cases of severe smoke inhalation, and a long, arduous road of rebuilding and recovery ahead for the hospital and the community it served. Art Jenkins spent another 2 weeks in the cardiac care unit of the neighboring hospital, his condition initially critical. His doctors were gravely concerned that his monumental exertion, coupled with severe smoke inhalation, had pushed his already weakened system beyond its limits. For several days, he hovered precariously between life and death. Sarah Miller was a constant visitor, sitting by his bedside for hours, sometimes speaking softly to him, sometimes just holding his hand, a silent vigil of gratitude and hope. She brought him news from St. Michael's, updates on the recovery of other patients, and quiet reassurances that he was not forgotten, that his bravery was the talk of the city. Then, slowly, remarkably, against the odds, Art began to rally. Perhaps it was the expert medical care, the relentless fight of his own stubborn constitution, or perhaps it was the potent, life-affirming medicine of a spirit rekindled, a purpose rediscovered. The man who had felt his life force inexorably ebbing away now had a powerful, indelible memory to anchor him, a reason to fight harder. He had faced death not passively, in the sterile quiet of a hospital room, but actively, defiantly, in a roaring corridor of fire, and against all expectations, he had triumphed. When he was finally strong enough to be moved out of intensive care, the change in him was palpable. The haunted, weary look that had clouded his eyes for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady light of confidence and self-possession. He sat up straighter in his bed. His voice, though still raspy from the smoke damage, had regained some of its old resonance. He was still a man recovering from a serious illness, still facing a long road of rehabilitation. But Arthur Jenkins was no longer defined by his sickness. He was defined by his courage. His discharge from the hospital was a quiet affair, just as he would have wanted it. No grand ceremonies, no media circus. But Sarah was there, along with the fire captain who had been so moved by his actions, and a small group of nurses from St. Michael's. The fire chief presented him with a specially minted civilian medal of valor, a simple but deeply meaningful token of the city's gratitude. Art accepted it with quiet dignity, his hand, still a little unsteady, closing firmly around the cool metal. He didn't return to the high-stakes world of construction. His body, though recovering, would never again be equal to the physical demands of that life. But he found a new, no less important, purpose. He began volunteering at a local community center, his experienced foreman's eye proving invaluable in helping to organize small repair projects, mentoring younger volunteers, sharing his lifetime of practical knowledge. He would sometimes share his story, not to boast or seek accolades, but to encourage others, to remind them that strength and courage can be found in the most unexpected individuals, at the most unexpected times. He spoke of the importance of vigilance, of looking out for one another, of the quiet duty that binds community together. He emphasized that courage wasn't the absence of fear. He'd been terrified, but the will to act in spite of it, to do what needs to be done when the stakes are highest. Arthur Jenkins' story became a cherished piece of local lore in that all-American town, a powerful, enduring reminder that heroes don't always wear capes or uniforms, nor do they always possess youth and vigor. Sometimes they wear faded hospital gowns. Sometimes they're the people we might easily overlook, individuals burdened by age or illness or the quiet struggles of everyday life, yet carrying within them an unextinguished ember of the truly extraordinary. His selfless, split-second decision in that fiery, smoke-filled hospital corridor was more than just a brave act. It was a profound testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a shining, unforgettable example of how one person's courage, forged in a lifetime of quiet integrity and summoned by an urgent, desperate call to duty, can make all the difference in the world. It's a story that resonates deep within the American heartland, a narrative that reaffirms our belief in the everyday hero. It reminds us that the true spirit of this nation isn't just found in grand pronouncements or historic battles recorded in textbooks. It lives and breathes in the quiet valor of the Arthur Jenkinses among us, ordinary men and women who, when faced with an unthinkable crisis, dig deep within themselves and find something extraordinary, not for personal glory, not for reward, but simply because it is the right, the necessary, the human thing to do. And in doing so, they don't just save a life. They uplift an entire community. They inspire a nation, and they show us, time and again, the enduring, unconquerable power of courage, sacrifice, and the quiet, indomitable heroism that beats strongly in the heart of ordinary Americans.